Max Verstappen had already put Red Bull at the top in Belgium, with a 1 minute, 47.070 lap. Then, only hours later, he dropped to third, nearly half a second behind the fastest car. But the real warning was not the lap time. It was the energy. Verstappen admitted that Spa would be painful because Red Bull could not rely on full electrical power throughout the lap. On a circuit built around long straights and maximum acceleration, that creates a brutal problem. The battery delivers its strongest push early, then the car can begin losing speed exactly where Verstappen needs it most. And after qualifying, one hidden weakness threatened to explain everything. Red Bull's car could look fast through the corners, yet become vulnerable the moment the electrical boost faded on the straight. That sounds like a power problem. The truth is even more dangerous, because it could shape Verstappen's entire race before the lights even go out. Subscribe to the channel. To understand why that warning mattered, you have to separate two things that sound identical, but are not: engine power and electrical energy. A Formula One car does not rely on fuel alone. It also uses stored electrical energy to add extra power during acceleration. When that boost is available, the car launches harder out of corners and continues pulling down the straight. But that supply is limited. The driver cannot use maximum electrical assistance everywhere, for the entire lap. The team has to decide where to release it, how aggressively to use it, and how much to protect for the next critical section. At Spa, that becomes a serious challenge. The lap is long. The throttle stays open for extended periods. And several sections demand heavy acceleration, one after another. Imagine trying to complete a long journey with a battery that delivers enormous power, but only for a limited time. You can use it early and gain speed immediately. But if you spend too much, the strongest assistance disappears before the journey is over. That is the trap Red Bull were facing. Verstappen could accelerate strongly at the beginning of a straight, then reach a point where the electrical support started to reduce. The engine was still working. The car was still moving at enormous speed. But the rate of acceleration changed. And against a rival that continued receiving stronger assistance, that difference became visible. Not always in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it appeared gradually. A rival began closing. The speed advantage disappeared. The Red Bull stopped gaining. Then, near the end of the straight, Verstappen became vulnerable. That is why a straight-line deficit can be misleading. People often look at maximum speed and assume the fastest number tells the full story. But two cars can reach similar top speeds in completely different ways. One car may accelerate strongly for the entire straight. Another may surge forward early, then stop gaining as quickly when the electrical deployment fades. The final number might look close. The journey to that number can be completely different. And in qualifying, that journey matters. Every fraction of a second gained under acceleration carries into the next braking zone. A driver who reaches the end of the straight faster can brake from a stronger position. A driver who loses acceleration may arrive with less momentum, even if the maximum speed does not look disastrous. This was not just about one number on a timing screen. It was about where Red Bull were losing time, and why Verstappen could not simply recover it by driving harder. That is what makes an energy problem so frustrating for a driver. If the car slides in a corner, he can change his line. If the front tires lack grip, he can adjust his entry. If the rear moves under acceleration, he can control the throttle more carefully. But when the electrical assistance reduces on a straight, there is almost nothing the driver can do. He can press the accelerator completely. He can position the car perfectly. He can leave the previous corner with maximum commitment. The missing energy does not return because he wants it more. And this is where Verstappen's frustration becomes easier to understand. Red Bull may have given him a car that felt competitive in the corners. The balance could still allow him to attack. The grip could still be strong enough to produce a serious qualifying lap. But every time the track opened into another long acceleration zone, the same weakness returned. The car was asking him to create an advantage in the difficult sections, then threatening to surrender part of it in the simplest looking part of the circuit. Straight ahead. Full throttle. No obvious mistake. Yet time was still disappearing. That sounds unfair. For a driver, it feels even worse. Because the lap can feel good from inside the cockpit. The braking points are aggressive. The corner exits are clean. The steering inputs are controlled. Then the timing screen shows a gap that feels larger than the mistakes. That is when the engineers begin looking beyond the driver. They study the acceleration traces. They compare where the electrical power begins to reduce. They examine how much energy was used earlier in the lap. And they ask the most uncomfortable question. Was Red Bull spending too much energy too soon? Because if that was happening, the problem was not limited to raw performance. It became a strategy problem inside the lap itself. Use more energy early, and Verstappen gains time immediately. Save more for later, and he risks losing time before reaching the final sector. There is no perfect solution when the available supply is not enough to cover every important zone. It is like having a small amount of water during a long race. Drink too much at the beginning, and there is nothing left near the finish. Save too much, and you struggle before reaching the point where you plan to use it. Red Bull had to choose where Verstappen would be strongest, and that meant accepting where he might be exposed. But the difficulty went deeper. Spa does not offer one isolated straight followed by a long recovery period. The demands keep returning. Acceleration leads into more acceleration. High speed places a heavy load on the entire energy system. So even if Red Bull protected enough electrical power for one section, that decision could weaken another. A gain near the start of the lap could become a loss near the end. A strong exit could cost deployment later. And by the final sector, the car might no longer have the same response Verstappen felt earlier. This creates another hidden problem. Confidence. A driver needs to know what the car will deliver when he presses the accelerator. If the available power changes from one part of the lap to another, the feeling can become inconsistent. The car may surge strongly once, then respond differently later. That does not mean the system is failing. It means the deployment plan is changing. But from the cockpit, Verstappen still has to predict the response while driving at the limit. And qualifying leaves no space for hesitation. He cannot wait to feel whether the boost will arrive. He has to commit before the answer becomes obvious. That is why the deficit was more than a simple weakness on the straight. It affected how Verstappen built the entire lap. He had to attack the corners hard enough to compensate. But attacking harder increased tire stress. More tire stress could reduce grip later. Reduced grip could damage the final sector. And suddenly, one energy limitation had created several new problems. This is where the story changes. Because Red Bull were not dealing with one isolated disadvantage. They were dealing with a chain reaction. Less electrical assistance on the straight meant more pressure in the corners. More pressure in the corners meant greater risk. Greater risk meant a smaller margin for error. And in qualifying, a smaller margin can decide the entire front row. But the most serious consequence was still ahead. A weakness that costs time over one qualifying lap can become far more dangerous during a race, when Verstappen has to attack, defend, recharge, and repeat the same energy cycle lap after lap. That is where Red Bull's hidden deficit threatened to become a much larger crisis. And this is where Red Bull's qualifying weakness becomes a race problem. Over one lap, Verstappen can hide a lot. He can brake later. He can carry more speed. He can attack the curbs. He can accept a nervous car for a few corners, because the lap ends quickly. But a race does not end after one lap. The same problem returns again, and again, and again. Every time Verstappen accelerates onto a long straight, Red Bull has to decide how much electrical energy to use. Every time he spends that energy, the car has to recover it somewhere else. That recovery does not happen by magic. The system collects energy when the car slows down, especially under braking. But Spa's long, fast sections create a difficult pattern. The car uses a huge amount of power, then has limited opportunities to rebuild the battery before the next major demand arrives. So Red Bull are not simply asking, how fast can we go? They are asking, where can we afford to be fast? That is a much more dangerous question. Because Verstappen may need maximum electrical assistance for an attack. Then, one lap later, he may need the same energy to defend. And a lap after that, he may need to recharge. The driver behind does not care. If a rival senses that the Red Bull is weaker near the end of the straight, the attack becomes easier to plan. The rival can remain close through the corners, wait for Verstappen's electrical advantage to fade, then use stronger deployment at the exact moment Red Bull becomes exposed. It is like two runners reaching the final part of a sprint. One used most of his energy early. The other saved enough for the last few meters. For most of the race, they may look equal. Then the finishing line gets closer, and the difference suddenly becomes obvious. That is the fear for Red Bull. Not constant weakness. Predictable weakness. Once rivals understand where Verstappen's car stops accelerating as strongly, they can build their entire attack around that point. And this is where straight-line speed becomes much more complicated than it looks. A car can be fast in a speed trap and still be vulnerable. That may sound impossible. It is not. The speed trap measures the car at one exact location. It does not show how quickly the car reached that speed. It does not show when the electrical boost began reducing. And it does not show whether the rival was still accelerating harder just before the braking zone. Imagine two elevators reaching the same floor. One moves quickly at the beginning, then slows near the top. The other starts more gently, then continues pulling strongly until the doors open. Both arrive at the same place, but they do not arrive in the same way. That difference matters in Formula 1. If Verstappen reaches his strongest speed too early, then loses acceleration before the end of the straight, a rival can continue closing even when the final speed numbers appear similar. That creates pressure before the braking zone. Verstappen has to defend the inside. He enters the corner from a worse angle. He places more stress on the tires. And he loses the freedom to drive the fastest racing line. One energy problem has now changed the entire corner. And this is where the consequences begin multiplying. Defending costs time. Defending also costs tires. When a driver moves away from the ideal line, the surface is often dirtier. There is less grip. The car slides more. The tires heat up. Then, when the next corner arrives, the car may not respond as cleanly. Now Verstappen is not only managing the battery. He is managing tire temperature created by the defense. That means the straight line deficit does not remain on the straight. It follows him into the next corner. Then into the next sector. Then into the next lap. And suddenly, Red Bull's hidden weakness is shaping the entire race rhythm. But there is another side to this. If Verstappen is attacking, the problem can become even worse. To pass another car, he needs to remain close enough through the corners to use the slipstream on the straight. But following another Formula 1 car reduces grip. The air behind the leading car is disturbed. That makes the front of the following car less effective.